Alright, so let's go back in time where you could curse the hell out of your boss and still show up to work the next day like nothing ever happened. You are a hard-boiled salesman who can't sell, so you're gonna blame it on the leads that your company hired your dusty ass to sell. You're going to now break into your office and steal such leads so that you can have the upper hand advantage. Your name must be Glenn Ross. What an awful name. Or at least that's the movie name. At release back in 1992, written by the great David Mamet, directed by James Foley, star-studded cast, legendary Al Pacino, Jack Lemmon, Alec Baldwin, Alan Arkin, Ed Harris, this dude named Jonathan Pryce, and the Predator Kevin Spacey. We open up in a dark, stylishly well-lit bar with our Shelley, who's on the phone. When Shelly's able to get off the phone with this girl, Dave pops into his phone booth and complains about how these leads that they were given aren't effective, leading them nowhere. After Dave unsuccessfully pitches the property, he and Shelly go into the bathroom where Dave can continue complaining about their leads. As Dave is about to leave the bathroom, he runs into their manager, or boss you can call it, John. John is requesting for his sales team to attend a conference to help boost their sales up. Shelley and Richard walk over to the bar and sit down, where Richard looks over at a man sitting by himself drinking at the bar, where Richard, as charismatic as he always is, allows the man sitting by himself to be drawn into the conversation. Shelley leaves the restaurant to walk across that thick-ass rain, looking like it's raining cats and dogs outside, to go back into the office. Not too long later, Dave and John enter the office, also wet from the rain, followed along by this third man, which is the presenter of the presentation, Blake. Blake verbally takes control of the room, as an alpha male apparently does these days, and tells our man, Shelley, to put down the coffee. Blake goes into his presentation. During Blake's speech, we learned that he was sent by Mitchell and Murray, the owners of the company that their sales team work for, in order to really shake things up. The first man to take initiative is our man, George, who hops on the phone to try to sell property to an old prospect. As Dave is dreading his circumstance, George paces back and forth, wondering if this is even the right career that he's even belonging to. As John is trying to leave to get home to his family, Shelley's trying to egg him on, trying to convince him to come outside for a drink, because you know how salesmen, they're never going to let you go until they'll at least try to sell you something. Shelley corners John outside of his car with a proposition. The proposition being that if he gives over the leads, a commission promised only if Shelley is able to close one of the leads, which Shelley hasn't been able to for a long time now. The offer tempts John, which he then increases the offer up to 20% of the lead. But since Shelley's broke ass couldn't afford the $100, John refuses to take him to the leads. Snap back over to the bar. George and Dave are drinking, talking about trying to get a come up, really. Later on, without phoning first, Shelley pops over to the house of a client, hoping to make a sale in person. Instead of finding the wife whom he was on the phone with earlier, instead he runs into the husband of the wife, which is probably going to be a much harder sell. Shelley hops into his spiel to the husband as far as the opportunity. This isn't sitting too well with the husband, who's getting a little bit impatient, and the husband casually is trying to kick Shelley out of his house, back into the rain where Shelley belongs. We snap back to George and Dave driving from the bar, where Dave, still infuriated, begins to wildly hash out a plan onto getting back at Mitchell and Murray, the owners of the company, by possibly even stealing the new leads. Back at the restaurant, Richard, still talking to the stranger, is talking in more intimate details of a conversation that, I don't know, man. Richard is kind of weird. Back at the bar, Dave and George talk a little bit more details as to possibly not only robbing their employers, but also what to do with the leads. As far as selling it would be $2,500 a piece for the both of them, as well as being hired by Dave's associate. Shelley goes back on the telephone to call his sick daughter to realize that she is not only still sleeping, but that the appointment that was supposed to be reserved for them was canceled. Shelley, a little bit upset over the phone, demands to speak to the head nurse, who is to no avail. He tells the nurse over the phone that he will have the money for her medical payment ready by tomorrow, which by the look of his face doesn't look like it's so true. By the end of the conversation, George realizes that not only is he pressured to get into it, he's also pressured not to get out of it. Dave explains to George that there may be consequences if he doesn't go through with the job. And back at the table with Richard and this stranger, Richard is settling into opening with his sales pitch. The next morning, where we have the aftermath of the robbery. Inside the office, Richard comes to find chaos with the police detective, the other salesman, and John all inside John's office, and to know what's going on, and only cares about whether or not they stole his contracts. And after the explosion between John and Richard, we have the detective getting up to let everybody know that no one is able to leave the office. Richard sits back at his desk, and George walks over, and they briefly catch up for the day. But Richard ultimately can't think of anything else besides the fact that he has to call back James, whom he sold the property listing to the previous night, but because of the blunder, he has to somehow try to sell it to him again. John walks over and gives Richard his leads for the day, which Richard isn't too happy about. Shelley returns like the snake that he is, in excitement that he closed somebody, a prospect, one of the leads from last night. So out of John's office, after being interrogated by the detective, Dave is angry, and he walks into the room right after Shelley was patted on the back over making that sale. Now this triggers the inner hater within Dave to the point where now he's going to get even angrier and asks for the better leads. During the sit down, Shelley gloats over the process of him selling the property listing the previous night. At the tail end of this, we have James enter the office looking to speak to Richard. But Richard realizes that something is wrong and asks Shelley to pretend to be one of his clients to see if they can fool James. As Richard is trying his best to get out of the room, James is trying to keep him there but can't seem to find the words to say. It seems like he's very nervous. He's dodging and ducking every single objection. But then here comes George exiting the office after the detective was asking him his questions. Now George looks pissed and actually is frankly offended that he's even being asked these questions, perhaps out of sense of guilt. And this moment begins to feel like a volcano erupting, as now we also have Shelley entering the office and John telling Shelley to enter the office to be interviewed next by the detective. George then erupts into madness and begins yelling all over the office as to why he was questioned by the detective. Richard and James have an opportunity to talk more details as to why James wants to cancel. The reason why James wants to cancel the deal is not because he wants to, it's because his wife is telling him to cancel the deal. Even more unfortunate for Richard, John decides to come out at the worst time possible and lets James know that the check was indeed cashed, which proves that Richard was lying to James earlier by telling him that the check wasn't cashed. And he told him that on purpose to see if he could allow more time so that he was able to collect the commission. James, after trusting Richard, this was the great betrayal. Well, actually a stab in the heart for James, and you can actually see that in his eyes. Knowing this now gives James the knowledge to now officially cancel the contract with John, which then bumps Richard off of the being top salesman and losing his chances of attaining that convertible. After James leaves, Richard unleashes a fury greater than none other in the office, and directs it fully on John, yelling and berating him as far as why he messed up his con, which would have guaranteed him that Corvette, something that John unknowingly did. Shelley, coming from the shadows like this creep that he is, walks up to John and pretty much rubs it in his face, that stuck his foot in his mouth, and actually allowed John to know something that he shouldn't have known, and which was that he indeed was the thief, the real thief behind the Glengarry Glen Ross leads. And it wasn't George and it wasn't Dave. It was indeed, the thief was indeed Shelley. So after the jig is up, Shelley begs John to keep his mouth quiet and to not tell the detective or the owners that he was indeed the thief. Desperately so much so that he was willing to even give up the entire commission over the sale after stealing the leads. John decides not to do so and instead walks inside to report Shelley to the detective, which triggers probably the end of not only his career, but probably will throw him in jail. Alright everybody, thank you for watching this recap. There will be more in tune. Keep up to date with the notification bell. Please like and subscribe, and we will be back with more. Check you later. Take care. Bye.